just outside the room. So one cell phone, one kind of packet with an SD card if you've lost them. Okay, with that, I'm so glad to see all of you back. I thought after all that food I might have trouble. This was the greatest challenge of the day. Would you return after lunch when you were still digesting? So it's so wonderful to see all of you back. We've had a great morning and a great lunch, and you're in for an equally fantastic afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our first panel of the afternoon, which is on confronting persistent poverty. This panel will examine some of the contemporary areas where poverty impacts life chances for individuals. The panel moderator is Amy Campbell. On the left, it's a change of format now. On the far left, Amy Campbell. Amy is Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Institute for Health, Law, and Policy at the University of Memphis Cecil C. Humphrey School of Law. She also serves as faculty coordinator of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Memphis Partnerships to Advance Community Transformation, also known as IMPACT for Children, a collective impact initiative of the university to address childhood trauma. Professor Campbell's scholarship focuses on developing health policy from a therapeutic, evidence-informed, and ethical perspective. Professor Campbell will provide fuller introductions of our speakers, but just to go across the panel, we have Professor Tomiko Brown-Nagin immediately to my left. Then we have Professor Dorothy Roberts, who are going down the line. We have Dayna Matthew, and finally Professor Dorothy Brown, and then Amy Campbell, our moderator. So I will leave it to Amy to take on the program. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dean Letsu. I'm excited to be here after a great morning and really an inspiring noon talk. And we certainly are appreciative that you came back, and we'll try to keep the energy up for everyone. We are talking here today at this time, pivoting a bit to poverty. And sort of the legacy and the issues now today around persistent poverty. Mr. Holder mentioned poverty and progress. And this today, right now, is an opportunity to pause, though, for a moment and think about sort of where are we situated today in Memphis. As you know, 50 years ago, on Sunday at his sermon, Martin Luther King talked and mentioned sort of structural economic inequality, and at that time was really thinking about a poor people's campaign and how do we address better health, better housing, living wages, right? Better education, all these issues that tie into sort of structural economic inequality and how we take on those challenges of the day. And that's what we're here to do with you. Professor Brown will do so from Emory, from her expertise in housing and racial inequities in opportunities around housing. We'll have Professor Brown-Nagin at the end from Harvard University will be addressing economic inequality and educational system and how to think about what's happening in our educational system and how we can address racial inequity and the economic inequity there. We have Professor Roberts from Penn who will be talking about health and health inequity and poverty and race. And the challenges that we see in that capacity. And Professor Matthew will also be talking about health, but really also we've seen a lot lately about zip code and how that matters in your health and your economic opportunity, your educational opportunity, right, the housing you have. She'll talk about sort of the impact of place on this conversation. And just briefly, since we are in Memphis, I think it's important to situate this in our local context. This is where Martin Luther King sadly spent his last days, and this is where we are today, 50 years later, thinking about the legacy and how to move forward. And as some of you in this room may know, sadly, Memphis took over #1 again in something. We're #1 for poverty. Out of MSAs over 1 million. We took that title, if you will, back again. And it's particularly pronounced among African Americans in our city, where 52% of the African American children in Memphis live in poverty. So these are very real issues. These aren't 50 years ago. These are issues of today. So I'm excited to get our panel underway. And we're going to start just by thinking about how their work, each speaker's work, ties and their interest in structural economic inequality and persistent poverty, how that ties a bit to the legacy that we're celebrating today and also thinking about as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. I write about the racial implications of tax policy. So you may think, what is she doing on this program? So my response is, I could be the money person. So if we were to reform the mortgage interest deduction, if we were to reform the exclusion for gain on sale of a home, we could get about $100 billion. Now I've got your attention, don't I? Okay, so I'm going to talk today about home ownership. I've written about the racial implications of tax policy in a number of areas, marriage, employer-provided pensions, but today I'm going to focus on home ownership and talk about some tax subsidies that you've heard of and show the way the tax subsidies are targeted towards how whites experience home ownership and away from how blacks experience home ownership. So we know that a majority of whites are homeowners, and we know a majority of blacks are not. So any tax subsidies for home ownership is going to disproportionately benefit whites. But what I have written, whites who are homeowners get different tax subsidies, and they track based on race. So there's this mortgage interest deduction that now you can get on a loan up to $750,000, and you can get home equity loan interest if you use the proceeds to improve your home. We also know, it may not be as familiar to us as the mortgage interest deduction, when you sell a home at a gain, if you're married, you can exclude, which means you get it tax-free, up to $500,000 a gain. If you're single, it's $250,000. Then there's a provision that most people don't really know. When you sell your home at a loss, it's not deductible. And that is a different rule than if you were to sell an investment like stock. If you sell stock at a loss, you can at least take advantage of some, if not all of the loss. So we see these rules: gain, tax-free, mortgage interest deduction reduces your income, loss, no tax break. And you go, well, what's the difference? How could that be different based on race? And it's different because of how blacks and whites experience home ownership. White homeowners tend to live in homogeneous white neighborhoods. Black homeowners tend to live in racially diverse neighborhoods. And sociological studies show us that when more than 10% of your neighbors are black, the value of your home falls. If more than 20% of your neighbors are black, the value of your home falls even more. And it goes on the higher the percentage of your black neighbors. So what does that mean? It means that whites who tend to live in homogeneous white neighborhoods are more likely to sell their house at a gain. They're going to benefit from that tax-free provision. Whereas blacks, research shows, in racially diverse neighborhoods are more likely to sell their homes at a loss, a non-tax deductible loss. So we see with the gain and loss provisions, whites are more likely to get tax-free income, and blacks are less likely to get tax-free income unless they're one of the few black homeowners who live in all white neighborhoods. And most blacks don't make that choice. So I think I'm getting close to my 4 minutes, but what I want us to think about are the racial implications of tax policy, which is something we rarely think about. When we think about taxpayers, or I should say when conventional wisdom talks about taxpayers, they don't talk about blacks. They talk about white taxpayers, and we need this tax break, or we need that tax break. But my research shows that blacks are more likely to pay higher taxes than their white counterparts because the tax subsidies are targeted towards how whites engage in society. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So happy to be a part of this panel and to mark this Dr. King's legacy. I want to start my remarks by going to Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here?, where he noted that poverty is the consequence of many evils, including lack of education. And so he talked about how quality integrated schools are vital to equality. Today, as we gather here and talk about an agenda for moving forward, I'm focused on that intersection of quality education and concentrated poverty. And here's the bottom line. We need in this country an educational system that meets the needs of families and students who live in high poverty neighborhoods, people who tend also to be of color. What we've done is to create islands of disadvantage. And our schools reflect the disadvantage in those neighborhoods. And I'll focus on two different kinds of disadvantage. One, there are disadvantages that are internal to the schools themselves. And two, there are disadvantages that flow from the neighborhood. So as to the school-based disadvantages, we have the enduring problems of race segregation, segregation by class, the assignment of inexperienced teachers to schools where there are majority students of color and impoverished students. Also matters like punitive disciplinary policies that push students out who need to be in school, that push them out of school. We have curricula in these schools that are predicated on low expectations. And then there are disadvantages that flow from the fact that in these neighborhoods, parents are underserved, the students are underserved, they face violence, they face malnourishment, they face the consequences of mass incarceration, and the result of that, which should be entirely expected, is that it's hard for these students to perform in school. There is neuroscience backing the finding now that when students experience all of these stressors, they have developmental delays, it's harder for them to learn to read, it takes longer, all sorts of disadvantages, and so we see what we call achievement gaps when these students are tested. In reality, it's an opportunity gap. And we need to invest in these neighborhoods, invest in these students, and find ways, holistic remedies to help them.
Good afternoon. Well, I'm waiting for a response. My work centers on the intersection of racism and sexism and poverty in a number of legal institutions. I've written about and advocated about reproductive justice, about the child welfare system, the prison system, and the healthcare system. And my most recent work has focused on the dangerous resurgence of biological concepts of race that try to explain the reason for racial and other kinds of inequality, including economic inequality. And in other words, the resurgence of the idea that the reason why we have racial and economic inequality in America is not because of continued structural this, but because of the innate traits of people who are Black and people who are poor. And so my work has brought together recently biological concepts of health and disease that try to explain away the huge gaps in Black and white health in this country as just the consequence of biological difference, and also very similar ideologies explaining away the persistent poverty that we see as just the result of innate differences between people who are poor and people who are more privileged. And was speaking about at the end of his life in 1966, a year before he started the Poor People's Campaign, he wrote, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane." And then the very following year, he began the Poor People's Campaign, where he called for a radical redistribution of political and economic power. He asked us to move beyond civil rights to human rights, and he also asked us to answer the basic questions facing society today. And when I think about the three evils that have come up in prior panels that King identified, the evils of racism, of poverty, and militarism, they are all linked to health. I think he might have said that health, as he really did say the year before, is a fourth evil because the inequalities of health result from all three of those three main evils. We can see how structural racism creates gaps in health, and we can see how poverty maintains structurally the poor health of many people in this country, and then how the money that could be spent on an equal and high-quality healthcare system for all is diverted toward war rather than affirming the basic human rights of human beings in this country. Now, Black people are disproportionately unhealthy, partly because they're disproportionately poor, but also because racism maintains structures of inequality that are bad for people's health. Because of residential segregation, Black people are more likely to live in neighborhoods that have little access to high-quality nutrition, that have the kind of stressors that Tomiko was just talking about in the education system, that have closer proximity to toxins that are bad for your health, and that experience the stress of racism and discrimination and violence, which is also extremely harmful to your health. One example of that is the maternal mortality rate in this country. Unlike every other developed country in the world, the maternal mortality rate in the United States is going up. And for Black women, it's 3 to 4 times higher than the rate for white women in this country. In some parts of the United States, like the Mississippi Delta, it's higher than in most developing countries, and a Black woman would be safer giving birth in Kenya, Rwanda, than in that part of the United States. It's also related to ideological concepts. I would say the very concept of biological race and the racial concept of disease, that Black people's bodies operate differently than other people's bodies. And this has led to low-quality health care for Black Americans, including, and I'll just give one example, the undertreatment of Black people for pain. We now know that Black patients, even in severe pain, are far less likely than white patients to be given pain relief treatment. Related, now it's been shown, to doctors' stereotypes about Black bodies, that we don't experience pain, that our skin is thicker than other people's skin, that we have less sensitive nerve endings. And so the very concept of the separation of human beings into biological races helps to support these gaps in health, horrific gaps in health that we see in the United States. So I think Dr. King, in putting together health inequities as the most inhumane and shocking form of inequality, and the importance of addressing structurally poverty as a human right, that he stood for guaranteeing the basic human right to a decent income and to basic health care as intertwined guarantees that we should be working for.
So I too want to say thank you to the conference organizers for an inspirational day, 2 days actually, and the privilege of being on a panel with such amazing scholars. These are women whose work I have followed, and this is like a dream come true for me to be with them, but I do want to point out that we are all women, so. So I'm going to speak very quickly because I know we want to get to the discussion part, and I have a few things to say. Like Professor Campbell, I want to just focus on what it was that Martin Luther King was doing when he was assassinated here. He was working on poverty. And poverty is the persistent one of the three that we are here to talk about today, of course. But if I may, in his, of course, amazing way, I'll quote him by saying a phrase from a speech that he gave at Stanford University in 1967. It was called "The Other America." The other America, that is the America that we're talking about in this panel today. And his words, of course, are better than anyone's could be put together, and I'll just quote one sentence from it. "In that other America, there is a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair." And he contrasted that to the America where the privilege of pursuing life, liberty, and happiness is free to all. There are two Americas. I hope from listening to that speech last night to leave you with three things that will be the emphasis of my comments in our conversation today. Number one, even though we're talking about poverty, I want to be very clear that we should not forget that poverty is different from racism, and racism is the reason that blacks and brown people are overrepresented among the ranks of the poor. Racism persists, and as Dr. King said in that speech, it's alive and well in the United States of America, and we can't fool ourselves into thinking that solutions that focus solely on poverty will also eradicate those issues that remain and persistently are due to racism, and not just poverty. One of them several have been mentioned in my colleagues' comments. I'll just focus on infant mortality. In the United States of America, a black woman is more likely to lose her child in the first year of life by 2.5 times at minimum. That's on average. And that doesn't matter whether she's a middle-class woman or a well-educated woman. The fact of the matter is that education, once it's controlled for, and income, once it's controlled for, will not change that outcome. Why? Because of racism. We still have a race problem. And so that's message number one I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of, that Dr. King did not lose sight of. Number two, a lot of my comments will be hoping to convince you that one of the ways most effectively to deal with poverty is to treat it as a public health problem. A public health framework does a lot for us, including giving us an integrated, holistic way of looking at education, of looking at housing, of looking at the environment, at looking at police violence, at looking at all what we call the social determinants of health, and how persistent poverty in all of those settings is woven together. It also will give us a way to look at solutions that are not only collaborative and integrated, but also pull in different streams of funding. One of the things that I learned when I worked on Capitol Hill is if you can't pay for it, doesn't matter how good the policy is. So we need to have a way to start paying for and reimbursing the kinds of solutions to persistent and concentrated poverty that I think a public health framework will give us. And that public health framework is expressed, for example, in looking at housing, the issue of place mattering. You've heard the term that your zip code is more important to your health outcomes than your genetic code. Well, that is all about the fact that there is a connection between families that cannot afford housing, right? 19 million American families are what are called severely cost burdened in the United States. And that means they spend between 30 and 50% of their income on housing. Well, what does that mean to their public health? Why does that matter to their health outcomes? Because they spend less on food, because they spend less on medical care, because if they have children, they spend less on their educational options and their educational enrichment. And as you know, this cycle, again, the public health framework, it repeats itself. If you don't have decent housing, you don't have a decent way to earn income. You don't have a decent way to get educational opportunities. Your children's social networks are compromised, and the cycle goes on and on. So place matters, and the public health framework, I hope, will be convincing. And then thirdly, perhaps maybe the most controversial thing that I'd like to advocate is that when I listened to Dr. King's 1967 speech, he is also careful to point out that in this other America, there are Mexican Americans, there are Puerto Rican Americans, there are white Appalachians, there are, as I said earlier, an overrepresentation of African Americans. But here's the point that I think is important. We must resist the political divisiveness of solutions that separate us by race artificially. The example I want to give is the opioid crisis. I want to be really careful here, but I got to get this out. Your president, last week suggested that the answer to the opioid crisis was to resurrect the death penalty for traffickers in drugs. But note, it was only some traffickers in drugs, right? It was only those traffickers in drugs who were selling the illicit drugs that have now spiked African-American deaths due to opioids because of street drug overdoses, right? But those pharmaceutical companies that are responsible for over 64,000 deaths a year, they don't get the death penalty, do they? This business of dividing us by race, where we are talking about deaths of despair. Despair comes in all colors, right? The joblessness rate, the hopelessness rate, the fact that there is income inequality, that is what is causing addiction across racial lines. And so I want to advocate that our solution should cross racial lines as well.
When she said we were all women, she was going to say we were all young. That's kind of what I thought we were going with that. But I want to hone in a little bit on what some of you have talked about, and this idea that when we think about poverty and we're looking at sort of the redistribution and how moving from a civil rights to a human rights kind of approach, the concern though about how do we lose focus on that structural racial inequality and the intertwining of those. How do we not lose the racial sort of inequality component when we move to sort of a focus around poverty? Or is that a concern, or how do we think about that?
So, I was listening to what Dayna was saying, and I actually think when you're talking about race, and sometimes when you talk about race, people say, oh, that's just class. And I say no, and let me show you. So I think it's important to pay attention to the data. I think it's, so for example, something I study, the black-white wealth gap, right? The largest gap is black-white. Doesn't mean there isn't a gap for other racial groups, it's just the largest gap. So why is it the largest gap, right? It could be the unique history that African Americans have dealt with in America vis-a-vis other groups. So for me, when I look at the racial implications of tax policy, I look at it across income levels, because I always get the, but isn't that class question? And what you see, for example, with home ownership, at all income levels, there's a higher percentage of whites that are homeowners than blacks at all income levels. That's not class, that's race. So when I look at my area of expertise, I always find a racial disparity. I've done other work that talks about employer-provided pensions, and yes, a higher percentage of whites are eligible and participate than blacks and Latinos, but in that area, the group that's worse off are Latinos. So it is important to look at this from a multi-racial perspective, but given the pervasiveness of racism, it is important to, even when we talk about class, to pay attention to, okay, so let's say national poverty rate is 22% blacks, or 22% of blacks are in poverty. Well, that means 78% aren't. So if we want to talk about solutions for all as opposed to just a certain segment, then we have to pay attention to the whole body politic and not just one part of it. So for me, I always focus on the structural racism that's built into the system. And racism permeates. So it's there, but it operates a little differently with that group and a little differently with that group, but it's there. And sometimes racism uses that group to beat up on that group. See? The model minority, right? They're successful. Why aren't you? Except the model minority myth that applies to Asian Americans, there's a racism that applies to Asian Americans. So that, if in fact the Asian Americans were really the model minority and not just a fiction used to beat up on black and Latinos, right? Then we would see Asian Americans in far more positions of power. We'd see Asian Americans run in Silicon Valley. okay? But that's not what happens. So when minorities are used against other minorities, it's usually in the service of white supremacy.
Yes. So I will jump in and agree that it's a both and proposition instead of either or. At the same time, I think it's really important to point out in answer to this question some research that's just come out of Harvard that was highlighted in the New York Times recently, showing that even for black males who grow up with parents in the 1%, there is a shocking possibility of downward mobility, which tells you that race is doing some independent work there. And so, I've done a lot of work and writing about the problems of the folks whom William Julius Wilson called the truly disadvantaged, trying to really focus on people who are underserved, who are living in our cities, who are on these islands of disadvantage. That's a very important and it's very close to my heart. Race and poverty are intertwined, and certainly in the context of the education system, one can see that. In the context of the children whom I'm talking about, who are living in concentrated poverty, one sees that blacks have a concentrated poverty rate of about 25%, 17% for Hispanics, as compared to 7% for whites. So we need to have a conversation that's flexible and able to recognize that race exacerbates poverty. At the same time, one can be middle class or upper class and black or Hispanic and face problems that are related to race or ethnicity alone. And then I want to bring us back to the question of history and the vestiges of the Jim Crow system and slavery, and point out when we're talking about education, schools that are segregated, when we're talking about neighborhoods that are impoverished and segregated, we need to remember our history. We need to remember, when Martin Luther King said that whites are implicated in the ghetto, well, white actors in government are deeply implicated in the creation of these islands of disadvantage. Federal government policy after World War II created a separate system even of public housing, and those boundaries remain with us today. And frankly, neither the federal government nor states and localities have done nearly enough to try to disestablish those islands of inequality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add that not only do we see the persistence of inequality in health outcomes when you control for income, so that, Dayna gave the example of infant mortality affecting middle-class black people as well as poor black people. Same thing for the example I gave of maternal mortality. That's deaths from pregnancy-related causes. Black women who are middle class and highly educated are more likely to suffer from death due to pregnancy-related causes than high school educated and poor white women. So this is something, the racism extends beyond the class divisions, and related to what I was saying about biological explanations, in a lot of research, researchers will say, well, then it must be something innate in black people if they have these health problems despite income. Leaping to a conclusion that it's something inside our bodies, then structural racism that affects black people, whether they're poor, middle class, or, as Tomiko was saying, even high and wealthy. The children of wealthy black people are more likely to be incarcerated and have low income than the children of less wealthy white people. But another reason why it's important to see the significance of racism in perpetuating poverty is because we have systems that perpetuate income inequality, largely because of the racism of people who don't want to change those systems, even though it would be to their advantage. So you have white working class people who oppose Medicaid. You have states that oppose the expansion of Medicaid because they have high African American populations, even though the white people who live in those states would also benefit from Medicaid. How do you explain a white person who needs Medicaid, who doesn't have the money to afford health care, opposing it? People give lots of different explanations, but my explanation is they don't want black people to have those benefits because it maintains white supremacy. And so racism is a reason, in my opinion, the primary reason that we have such an unequal economic system in the United States. I want to mention just one more thing quickly, because Dorothy Brown reminded me of this when she said, people don't think of black people when you say the word taxpayer. And there are so many ideological stereotypes about black people, especially black mothers, that black mothers are ripping off taxpayers by having babies just to get welfare. You know, this is what fueled the abolition of the entitlement to welfare. The idea that black people are a burden to taxpayers, that black people are the ones who are going to use all these services and therefore cost a lot to taxpayers. It places black people in opposition to taxpayers. And again, that fuels the resistance to more equalized policies that would end persistent poverty. Again, even though white people would benefit from those policies, but racism is an impediment to the dream that Dr. King had when it comes to poverty, as well as when it comes to black people and other people of color's rights.
I just want to add two things. One, you saw how fast they walked back that dismantling of the ACA. It was complicated why it was so hard to dismantle, but one of the really important reasons was because white people woke up and said, oh, that includes us too.
Right, exactly, right.
And so that dismantling of Medicaid really came, and so this is, I hope, some more evidence. I think I want to complicate the picture just a little bit to talk about why it is that persistent poverty is not getting solved. And that is not to say I disagree with anything that my colleagues have said. I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. And I'm going to see if this is as safe a space as I think it is. Because I'm going to say that one of the things that has been a surprise to the black middle class community is that abandoning the inner city didn't work for us, right? Abandoning poor black middle underclass did not work. Okay, I'm egged on now, so I'm going to keep going, right? And so I'm pointing the finger at myself also, because I thought in sort of pursuit of the American dream, I'd move my family out to a white neighborhood, right? And I'd put my kid, I hope this is not being taped, right? And I'd put my children.
Oh, it's being taped. It's always being taped.
But I didn't believe the lie. But to be very serious about it, what we ended up doing was importantly marked in the research that Tomiko is just referring to. Maybe because we now see that being black and middle class does not mean that you get out of concentrated poverty at any faster a rate than the people that you left behind are. It doesn't mean that your children get any better a shot. It doesn't mean they get arrested less. It doesn't mean that they get treated any differently from the police officers. And so maybe the best and the brightest of our community will now return to the mission of lifting all boats with the tide, right? And not just those of us who could get out.
So I want to pick up on something Tomiko said and something Dayna said to tie it together. So Tomiko said something about history being really important, and nowhere is it more important than when we talk about home ownership in America. And we talk about, to put it politely, barriers to entry for blacks, right? Who who were not eligible for FHA insured loans. So if you look at the history of homeownership in America, before FHA fixed 30-year low interest rate mortgages, people paid cash for homes or a 3-year loan. There was no such thing as long-term fixed financing, which means the homeownership rates for whites wasn't that high. But you see a dramatic increase after the FHA and the veterans loans, right? That blacks were excluded from. And what has happened over time with the Fair Housing Act is the federal government said, okay, we won't sanction it anymore. But they've never done anything to compensate for the century worth of wealth that was built up in the white community that wasn't built up in the black communities, okay? So there's some atoning that needs to be done. It isn't enough if you've beaten me up for decades to say, okay, I'm gonna stop now. Well, I'm kind of bloody, and I might have lost a couple of body parts, and I don't look the same way. So you can't just say, okay, now we're all even, right? So there has to be some atoning with respect to the blatant history of race discrimination. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about what Dayna said. She bought a home in a predominantly white neighborhood. So I'm going to say that's a good financial investment, okay? Because that's what the research says. It is
I just sold it too.
Okay? But was I right? It was a good financial investment, okay? But there's the downside to the financial investment. The downside to the financial investment is there was a CNN opinion piece by a African-American law professor at Wash U. She and her husband, they're both black, going on a cruise. Before they go on a cruise, they send a picture of their children to the police station. And they say, my children are going to be, they're both boys, they're tall boys, my children are going to be walking in the neighborhood where we live. They belong here. Basically, please don't kill them. That's the price you pay for a good financial investment. So you're between a rock and a hard place. There's also research that shows black homeowners in wherever we live tend to be around more lower income whites than similarly situated white Americans. So it doesn't, you can't earn your way out of it. You just have to decide, okay, I'm willing to live with this, I'm not willing to live with that, except nothing's perfect. So there's a problem of history that's really important that has never been dealt with, and there's a problem of where you live and how your family will navigate that space is just so much more complicated when you're African American. So if you stay in the inner city, then you're going to deal with food deserts. If you potentially, right? I think of my mother who lived in the South Bronx where we grew up until she moved to Long Island. My mother, retired nurse, she was walking a long ways to get food, but she knew, what she needed to eat. So you deal with that. You deal with the lack of supermarkets. You deal with the dry cleaners that isn't there. There's a price you pay. And if you go to the suburbs, you're dealing with a different price. It's really very complicated. And when people say to me, well, Dorothy, you're saying we shouldn't buy homes? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to be intentional, because there are consequences, financial and health-wise, to where it is you choose to live, if you have the choice.
Yeah, picking up on that, you guys are having a great conversation, sort of thinking about the common themes that sort of are kind of really coming to the fore. The importance of policies that may look neutral on their face, but that perpetuate the historical racism, right? The importance of place and zip code. We recently had an article here that in 38106, 38126, you die 13 years younger, your longevity sort of is 13 years shorter than a few miles away in Collierville. And so that place and how much that matters, and the poverty and sort of the racial. Are there themes that you're hearing as you explore each other's work and think about?
So one of the themes I'm hearing, and I thought about it when I read, Serena Williams' story about her childbirth experience, and how if she hadn't been persistent and a self-advocate, I don't think Serena would be here, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things I'm hearing is you can't, if we're talking about blacks in America, you can't get away from racism. You can't get away from educational problems. You can't, because even in the all-white schools, when your children are one of a few, then there are going to be discipline problems. Mm-hmm. When they do something that a white kid, because I have friends who I have a good friend who has 2 black boys, and the white kids cut up, but when the black kids cut up, it's a whole other problem. Mm-hmm. Well, lucky for those boys, their mama's a law professor, so she gets it taken care of, but I'm on the phone listening to the stress as she describes, somebody else she had to have a come to Jesus talk with, right? So it doesn't matter how much income you're having to deal with these problems. And I don't know if somewhere along the line we thought maybe we'd escape, right? But if you're not going to escape. So the question is, yes, Dayna's right, we're tied into this together, right? So how do we fix it? But you can't earn your way out of it.
Mm-hmm. I just want to highlight one other thing for us to think about as we talk about getting persistent poverty under control, and that is stress. It may be one of the most understudied and unappreciated impacts or factors that impact population health. Mm-hmm. Being poor is very, very stressful, right? Being poor means my finances are compromised, and when the doctor tells me I should go and exercise so that I can have better health behaviors after a 12-hour shift, name the low wage paying job, I don't have a safe place to do that. That talk that your friend is having with her children, I had it with my kids, and my kids have told me how stressful it was for me to constantly be putting fear of the police, fear of white authorities, and fear of their safety on the table for them every time they walked out the door. This has a serious health impact. And I think that one of the things we should be intentional about is thinking about measuring and mitigating stress for all populations if we want to close health disparities and make us live longer and not die quicker than whites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so true. That is an aspect of experiencing racism in America that is often left out of these studies that try to explain all these bad health outcomes, and they don't look at the stress of just living in a racist society, which is the best explanation. The best because in fact, many of these bad outcomes we've been talking about do not exist in West Africa, where our ancestors came from. So it's not anything inside us, it's living in America. That is what is producing these outcomes for various reasons, the experience of stress and the structural inequalities we've been talking about. One theme that I've heard on this panel from everyone is the role of residential segregation and how that is part of the legacy of racism that we have to remember was violently created in the United States, including in northern cities. Many people have this idea, well, black people choose to live in these neighborhoods, and this is not saying that we may not want to live there, but the reason why the neighborhoods exist and the reason why they have poorer access to all sorts of resources is because of a violently imposed segregation, separation of the races in cities like Memphis and Chicago and Philadelphia, and I could go on. And that then creates the opportunity for harmful policies to be concentrated there and not affect the lives of most white people in America. And so they're able to maintain policies that help poverty persist, help health inequities persist, because it doesn't affect everybody equally. I also want to point out.
Can I just say,
Sure,
it
go
doesn't
ahead.
affect people equally, which makes it invisible to one group.
Exactly.
And it's like in our face in another. And we're like, how come you don't see it? And they're like, see what?
Right, because I literally don't see it. Right, exactly. I literally don't see it because I'm not living there. Yeah, exactly. It's a very powerful way of making these inequities persist generation after generation after generation. I also just want to point out one other connection from another panel to ours, which was the criminal justice panel, and the way in which our criminal justice system operates to punish poor people because they are poor. The bail system, which was mentioned, is a system that puts people in jail and keeps them there only because they cannot afford bail. It doesn't matter whether they're guilty or innocent. That is irrelevant. All that matters is whether they can afford bail, and thousands upon thousands of innocent people are locked up, not to mention the people who may have committed a crime and it hasn't been adjudicated yet, but it's often a petty offense that they then spend years in jail, far beyond what they deserve, so-called deserve, just because they can't afford it. And then, on top of that are added court fees, fines, other kinds of monetary sanctions that build up and build up and build up and make it more likely they're going to return to jail. So our criminal justice system, to a large extent, is a system of punishing poor people and affirmatively making it difficult for them to escape poverty. It's institutionalized repression of people through the criminal justice system just because they're poor, and of course, disproportionately targeted at African Americans and to a lesser extent Latinx people, although with immigration detention, we now see it expanding in that community as well. So, and it's connected to our panel, or well, I guess what Dayna and I have been talking about, and others, health inequities, because many of the people, if not most of the people in jails and prisons as well, are there for health problems. They have substance abuse problems, mental health problems, and this nation takes an approach to lock people up because of their health problems. And so another call, I think, of Dr. King in attending to our basic human rights is not to imprison people for health problems, but to take, as Dayna, you started out with, a public health approach to these social issues, these burning violations of human rights at a societal level that we should be ending.
And if I can pick up on what you were saying about bail and how poor people are in jail, many of these people, of course, are parents. And so this institutional racism institutional policies that deprive people of liberty because they are poor has an impact on students who are deprived of their parents, who are deprived of their parent support with homework, who are deprived of stability, which shows up in schools, shows up in kids who have all of these stressors and who find it difficult to function to their ability in school. And yet, many times, people wonder, well, why aren't the kids doing as well? And then they resort to these biological explanations. Right. Yes. No, there are policies and practices that are giving us the world that we live in. And we need to truly realize that and try to change those policies and practices. And I want to tie into one other thread that we've been talking about. One, the salience of history, and two, this project of creating solidarity across race and within races. So trying to build community among middle class and upper class, blacks and other minorities, and people who are in entrenched poverty, who often are disproportionately people of color. So when we think about Dr. King and the Poor People's Movement, it is vital to realize, as Mr. Holder started to say this morning, how controversial that project was. And not only because of Vietnam, but because of the focus on poor people, the focus on people who were not respectable. So Dr. King got pushback, he got skepticism from any number of civil rights organizations, any number of well-known civil rights leaders. The idea, well, this shouldn't be a priority. The idea of, well, let's just let the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act do its work. These folks don't need this targeted help. So if we're saying that finally middle-class African Americans are starting to realize that we can't buy ourselves out of racism, well, this has been a continuous issue in our history of trying to build solidarity regardless of our particular status inside of this box of race. And then the other thing I wanted to say is the schools are affected by the moving out of African Americans and wealthier people from poorer people. So one of the reasons that people who are in Chicago or Detroit or Memphis in these failing schools don't have the ability to change their circumstances is that they don't have allies. They don't have allies of influence. And so as we think about moving forward, I hope we'll think about activism and pushing politicians wherever we are in our lives to uplift those people who really are left behind.
And that's a great segue. As we get ready, we do want to have your questions, and we've left 15 minutes at the end. So in 4 minutes, I know you said we can't fix it, but let's do it in 4 minutes. What would be, for each of you, maybe go right down and just what's the one sort of, we're thinking of the agenda, the forward-looking agenda, what's sort of the one really take-home point that you would want to make sure is heard from what we've been talking about today? And again, we'll be taking audience questions then.
Okay, my one takeaway is the next time you hear someone talking about tax policy, ask them what the racial implications of it is, right? People do not associate race with tax. So, and well, let's be clear, people don't want to talk about tax, period. But it's April. It's April. Hello. So in April, because that's the only time we talk about it, when somebody's talking about tax, make them think about what the racial implication of tax policy is.
So my takeaway is a little bit more, it's less practical. It's philosophical. I would like us all to realize, as Dr. King did, that we are our brother's keeper, right? That as the society seeks to be a successful, a just, a civil, a democratic society, we cannot be that if we continue to believe that poverty, or to buy the bill of goods that tells us that poverty is some kind of a character flaw. And nowhere is this seen better than in the resurgence of transforming what had become a very successful Medicaid expansion to create health insurance for all, where everyone in this country was entitled to the basic right to health care. It's quickly being unraveled and transformed. How? By attaching conditions that tell us whether you deserve health care or not. Are you working hard enough? Notwithstanding the fact that most people who are on Medicaid are already working, right? This is a resurgence of the 16th century kind of the deserved poor. And I would like us to resist adopting and accepting that frame of poverty. It is not a character flaw to be poor. It is a structural flaw for which we are all responsible.
And I'll just list a few things that I think are really important as we think about the education system and going forward. You know, we have spent many years doing wonderful work on issues of school desegregation, school finance. All of that is vitally important. I think, though, that we need to have a moment going forward where we really think about school culture and implementing policies and practices that respond to the stressors of students who are poor, who are students of color, and who have unique disadvantages or needs as a result of that. So having a growth mindset in schools, meeting the students where they are, regardless of who their parents are, and then models of intervention that bring together many different types of stakeholders, so the public health folks, the psychiatrists, teachers with special training. All people are needed to try to grow the capacity of those students and their parents.
I want to piggyback on Dayna's comments about blaming people who are poor for a character flaw and point out the resurgence and expansion of the explanation of those character flaws as rooted in the inherited traits of those people. That ideology has not ended in the United States. In fact, it is growing. Just a couple weeks ago, the New York Times had a huge op-ed piece in the Sunday paper by a geneticist arguing that we should pay more attention to racial differences, not only in health, but he also mentioned educational outcomes based on our differences in genes. And so pay attention to this and resist this explanation for social inequality is rooted in biological inequality, whether it's by race or by class or gender, we'll add that, and instead see how that obscures the structural reasons why we have persistent inequities along these lines, and also to recognize that a healthier society only comes from less inequality. And a more equal society would be healthier for everybody in the society. And we should be advocating for our basic human right to health care, to an end to poverty, and to an end to the carceral solutions to what are actually the result of structural inequalities.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll take questions from the audience.
Hi. This is my third try.
Yeah, that's true.
You made it!
He came up first this time.
Sorry, I had to cut you off. I appreciate it. My name is Steve Reifler. I'm a history professor at Marist College in Poughkeepsie. And last week we had Michelle Alexander speak at our school, and of course we all read the book beforehand, so my head's about to explode. And I have about 25 questions and don't want to pontificate.
You get one.
I know. I know. Well, I'm actually going to sneak two in because they're related, I think. And firstly, let me put on my glasses. Firstly, I'm thinking as far as education is concerned, and that because of these structural inequalities that exist, rather than like an affirmative action for education to help people get into school, because of what's going on in the home with poorer people, be they black or white, but more so black than white, should there be money put into making the transition and helping the high school student, from my experience, the high school student develop before he goes to college so that the success rate is greater? And then, I'm sneaking two into one, and then as far as the problems that are in neighborhoods that are also, in the family that discourage educational practices because of those stressors that all of you talked about, the stressors at home that make it harder to study, that because you're worried about eating, you're worried about what's going on in the family, what's going on in your neighborhood. How about some kind of program that recognizes that, and there's kind of an affirmative action program to help these families so they can in turn benefit education and benefit these young people that are coming out, so it breaks the cycle that is allegedly something, according to that latest article and people like Charles Murray.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, so just answer that.
We got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right, so a quick response to that, there's a lot there. I would completely favor social and psychological supports for families, resources. Yes, we should spend money in all of those ways. We also, there's a movement towards trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive schools. I think that it started in Massachusetts in part, and I think that that's something that I'd like to see spread throughout the country to help those students. And as for the college question, you know, there's a tremendous educational return on the investment in college. So I would like to see as many people as can go to college, whether it's community college, you know, our elite institutions, competitive institutions. There's a value in going to college. So I wouldn't want to support some, you know, systemic moving away from those efforts.
Oh, we'll be around after. Yeah. Can I take the question in the back?
My father,
which I can kind of see.
My father has on the back of his business cards, 97.5 cents out of every black dollar goes to the white community. No wonder we're poor and powerless. He also says, you can't be what you can't see. Now, I would like to know what you believe are black folks' responsibility as far as combating poverty. One of the issues about moving out of the neighborhood, and that's the you can't be what you can't see. So my question is, and to some extent, if you don't go to school, you won't get a better job. I'm a child welfare attorney, so I see intimately every day what happens with black folks in poverty situations or dependency situations. And I'd like to know what you think black folks' responsibility is for bettering the situation as far as poverty is concerned, and especially middle-class blacks who, as soon as they get some money, they leave. Now, I live in the community, but in addition to the housing, the way you spend your money, what's our responsibility?
Thank you.
So I'm going to start. I think our responsibility is leadership, and for not just us four and no more, but for our entire communities, right? I'm not telling people where to live, because that's why I was very transparent about where I live, but I am telling us where we put our money and where we put our mouth, right? The landmark legislation that we have been talking about succeeding in passing was passed because black, middle-class, well-educated physicians and lawyers and others took the responsibility of taking those cases to court, took the responsibility of organizing, took the responsibility of advocating, right? Simpkins versus Moses Cone Hospital, which is why we have Title VI, was 3 physicians and 2 dentists suing on behalf of their patients who were discriminated against. That's what we have to do. We have to start leading on these issues for our entire community, not just for us four and no more. Affirmative action, fine, but affirmative action for the poor as well as for the middle class and the upper class African Americans, right? Residential desegregation, educational opportunity, food access. If you live, I'm gonna tell you, I bought my house back in the neighborhood where I think that I have more of a chance of having a footprint and having influence. And I'm not gonna tolerate a food desert, right? I am not going to tolerate having to tell the police to keep an eye out for my kid. I will be active, and I'll be active on a part of my entire community. That doesn't mean you have to go to court for everybody. It could mean that when you go to the PTA meeting, you go for yourself and the single mom who can't go also. It could mean that what you do not just for your child, but you do it for other people's children also who are suffering as well. But we should start thinking more communally and less individually. That's what I think black people owe to one another.
Well, and let me clarify this. I'm not talking about just black folks' interactions with white folks, but black folks' interactions with black folks.
Well,
so here's how I'll respond. I want to make 2 points. One, there was a study that showed a black from Harvard had a harder time getting a job interview, getting an interview offer, than a white from Harvard. So yes.
Well, I went to Yale, so I can believe that.
They just didn't test Yale, but had they tested Yale, they would have found the exact same thing. So, you know, I think it's great to go to college as well. I just want us to understand structural racism in the labor market goes back to where you get your degree from. So it doesn't matter, you can get it from the highest, you know, the most prestigious school possible, you still will be faced with racism. With respect to, you know, what should black people do? You know, one of the things I say, because I think I can't help you if I don't help myself. So the first thing I have to do is get my financial house in order. One way to do that is to save for retirement. Study after study after study shows, regardless of race, Americans do not have enough savings for retirement. So all of you with employer-provided pensions, max out. Those of you who are not fortunate enough to have a job that comes with it, save for your retirement. Because it's coming, and we don't know what's going to be around to help you when we do get to the retirement point. You know, so I think we have to think about getting our financial house in order before we can help anyone else.
I just want to add one more thing, which is that for the last 30 years, I've been working with black women organizing for reproductive justice, and there are groups of women of color, but especially I've been involved with black women who have coined the term reproductive justice, who have been advocating for human rights for all people at the community level and at the national policy level. So I was involved for a long time with Black Women's Health Imperative, for example, which is the only national organization advocating specifically for black women's health. And we worked both in Washington to shape policy, but also in communities, including self-help circles that took place in women's living rooms. And so there are organizations that are dedicated to working on ending racism and sexism and poverty in black communities. And I strongly advocate for people finding those and joining them and working at that level to make change.
We have 3 minutes, so quick question.
Hi, my name is Harry Cash, and recently Wendy Thomas wrote a great article for the New York Times that spoke about how Memphis gave up on Dr. King's dream. And could you talk a little bit about the importance of the community in supporting your work? Because a lot of times this is controversial, and we need to make sure that we are supporting you all in a way where you can continue to do so. And also, equally important, how can we do a better job of educating the larger community so that we can better organize to address these issues?
Yeah, I read that article. It was depressing. There is a new kind of scholarship called community engaged scholarship. I hesitate to sort of get wonky from an academic perspective, but it basically says that whereas we have historically thought of ourselves as experts in this and experts in that, we've forgotten that people in communities are the experts truly in what they're experiencing and how they're experiencing it. So community engaged scholarship seeks to partner with authentically researchers in the community who will start to name the kinds of problems that Memphis is experiencing, or in my case, Charlottesville is experiencing. Yes, I am from Charlottesville. And one of the things that doing community engaged scholarship in Charlottesville has taught us, one, is that their #1 desire right now is for an apology. #1, they want an apology from the police department for kindly escorting the white supremacists on and off the lawn while macing the kids who were protecting against white supremacy. That's what they want. Well, you don't know that until you ask the community. What do we want from the community? I know it's hard, but trust us one more time. right? Engage with us one more time. Give us the right to ask the questions, to partner with the data, to disseminate the information. Give us the opportunity and make us bring our rich resources. There are no universities in the top 25 that are not located in the midst of total inequity. I don't care where you went to Yale, you went to Harvard, you went to Brown, you went to wherever you went, New York City, Columbia, you're sitting in the middle of a place of total inequity, right? Hold us accountable for that. Ask where are the pipeline programs that will help your kids. I think high school personally is too late. Where are the pipeline programs that are going to help your kids from preschool to K through 12 to be able to attend those institutions that are located and situated in the places where they are inequitable? Ask for a living wage, right? And organize yourself to not work for our universities anymore until you get a living wage, right? So what the community can do is partner with the researchers and partner with the people who are seeking to bring equity in a way that's new and different, that's not isolated from the community, but cooperating and collaborating with it.
I want to thank this amazing panel here. And just mention, we have the final panel coming up here in 15 minutes at 3:45. I think there are refreshments, but they'll, go ahead, sorry.
I'd like to thank the panel too. What a spectacular, powerful panel, like the two others that have preceded it and the one that will follow. I also want to just personally acknowledge Dorothy Brown. Dorothy was a colleague of mine we go back 27 years, and we've been on the faculty together in 2 schools. And she is not only a wonderful panelist here, but she played a real major role in connecting us with so many of the other folks who are part of this program today. So thank you, Dorothy. So we'll resume at 3:45.